10 minutes past 8 o'clock. It is Thursday morning, February the 4th. Good morning, everybody. I'm Scott Michlin. Thank you for tuning in to KSJE 90.9 FM over the air here in San Juan County, New Mexico, 103.3 FM over the air in Durango, Colorado, and streaming everywhere from our website this morning at KSJE.com. To our visual radio viewers this morning, we are having some streaming difficulties, but we are recording the program, so we will post the video very shortly to our YouTube channel, our Facebook page, and our Twitter account in just a few moments. But in the meantime, we're going to be on the radio with my guest this morning, Paul Reed from Archaeology Southwest and Salmon Ruins. We've got a number of topics to talk about this morning, including some new look at some historical monuments across the country and across the world. We'll get Paul's perspective on that and much more coming up in the next few moments right here on KSJE. And then, of course, we will go at 9 a.m., we hope, to our COVID-19 Community Information Program, which we stream on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. But we will have it nonetheless. This morning, we'll be talking with our favorite doctors from Sound Regional Medical Center, Dr. Aaron Philpott, Dr. Brad Greenberg, and we'll also hear from restaurant owner Mick Hug. That's coming up this morning, 9 a.m. live on Facebook and YouTube, of course, and Twitter, and then rebroadcast on the radio at 5:06 p.m. on KSJE and KSJE.com. On the radio side of things at 9, Mick Hess is going to take us roving with the arts this morning. Mick is featuring music from composers Schoenberg and Rachmaninoff on the program this morning, so you'll be hearing that on the radio at 9, so we hope you'll stay tuned for that as well. And don't forget, you can also connect with us on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter, in addition to our Instagram page. Let's talk about the weather forecast. Outside, it is mostly sunny at the moment with a temperature of 30 degrees in Farmington. We are expecting a mostly sunny day. We could still see some clouds rolling in throughout the day. The high, though, 45 in Farmington, clear, and 26 overnight. Sunshine again on Friday with a high of 45 degrees and an overnight low of 26. Mostly sunny and 47 on Saturday, partly sunny and 52 on Sunday, and maybe another chance of a snow shower on Monday with a high of 54 degrees. Well, let me turn to my guest who is joining us this morning, and the link is working, I believe, so we can see and hear Paul Reed from his home outside the Taos area. Paul's joining me this morning. Good morning, Paul Reed. Good to see you.
Good morning, Scott. Glad to be back on with you.
Yeah, it's good to have you here, and appreciate that. And as I mentioned, we're talking a bit about historical monuments this morning, and of course, this is something that you deal with in your work pretty regularly, correct?
Right. A lot of my work has been focused on parks and monuments, as well as other lands, but yeah. Sure.
And so we're hearing, I guess the issue would be is that folks are maybe rethinking some of these monuments and how they've been named in the past, and maybe what we should be doing about them these days as we become more aware of some other groups and entities that were also involved in these places, in these sites.
Right, that's right. And this is kind of part of the natural evolution of society, to talk about things, sort of figure out how we want to move forward. One of the examples is about the Coronado State Monument. Well, it used to be Coronado State Monument, and that was actually changed not that long ago to the Coronado Historic Site. This is down just really outside Rio Rancho in the community of Bernalillo. And the interesting thing is most of what is preserved there is an ancient pueblo at a site called Cuahua, that is a southern Tiwa or northern Tiwa focused pueblo. And it has the name, of course, of Coronado, one of the Spanish conquistadors. So, yeah, it's interesting times, I think we can say.
Right.
So, the article that I sent you is actually an op-ed piece by an individual who is an elder at Santa Ana Pueblo. His name is Manu Rainbird, and he expresses a pretty strong opinion that this state monument, this state park in New Mexico, should be changed away from Coronado's name to one that reflects its heritage, again, as a Tiwa Pueblo. So, and I support this move, quite honestly.
Right. And so talk a little bit about that, Paul Reed, and we're showing the article right now for folks who are watching us on video. And this is an opinion piece, not a news piece, just to make that perfectly clear. But the issues would be then that because it's called Coronado, the visitors may get the wrong impression of its significance, or it obviously doesn't even mention then the Pueblo site in the name at least, right?
That's right. And the prime attraction there, just like people wanting to visit, Chaco Canyon or Mesa Verde, is an ancestral and ancient Pueblo site. So it is rather ironic considering, what happened with Coronado coming into the Southwest, that this largely Pueblo site would retain his name. Now there are historic artifacts there. It's clear that Coronado and his army camped, in that vicinity. So the site certainly has the historic significance of that portion of it. But I think folks are just looking at this as, probably a little too much European bias as we try to understand this very complicated mosaic, and canvas, if you will, of New Mexico's history. And certainly many folks of Spanish descent, have concerns as we look at different aspects of our history. But, I think that many sites in the country, across the country and certainly in our state, don't have their ancestral names or their indigenous names. So, and, what we call things, place names, matter tremendously in how we view those. So again, that's, part of what strikes me as making this a pretty good case for renaming this monument.
Right. And I guess, as we see across the country too, some of these place names have evolved over the years to reflect kind of our new understanding and our new respect for some of the other folks that were part of this. As you mentioned, there are artifacts, more of the Coronado artifacts at this same site then, and that is probably where it got its name from, right? Is that the thought process behind this?
That's right. But if we look at the history of the designation of this place and sort of having it set aside and protecting it from development or other settlement in the more modern era, folks knew that there was this large 1,000+ room Pueblo there. So clearly, the original plan to protect it reflected, this dual nature to the heritage. So, and I think if we look at it from that point of view, the site has retained Coronado's name for quite a period of time. And, again, I think it's reasonable to have the site and the historic property assume a different name, and I don't think we lose anything by doing that. The story of Coronado's encounter with indigenous people in the Southwest is still going to be told. So there's no risk of losing history. That's often the counter argument that we get if we want to change the way we've called something, maybe move some statues out of a public square and put them in storage. These issues don't change the history that's already happened. What they do is they reflect, what I hope is a more diverse society that reflects many different viewpoints and the many diverse cultural groups who, in our case, in the case of New Mexico, helped create, the history and the cultures that we know.
Right, and that does bring up a great point, though, about the other folks maybe who do take pride in that monument named for Coronado and the Spanish ancestors and things like that kind of reflect some of that. So obviously taking his name off of that might offend or upset some of those groups and those people with maybe some claim to that spot as well. As you mentioned, artifacts were found there and things like that. How do we please everybody? Can we do it?
It's a challenge.
Yeah.
But again, I guess if I was going to look at it on balance, I would say that, that property has carried Coronado's name for decades. So, and it's not what is preserved there. The reason people go there primarily is not to encounter aspects of Spanish colonial culture necessarily in New Mexico. There are other places that honor that, Spanish colonial homesteads, and that very rich history is protected in other state parks and, components of national parks and monuments. So that's where I would come down on that part of it. And I think in a diverse society that has people with very different perspectives and quite honestly, diametrically opposed perspectives on this history that involve warfare and conflict, we have to be sensitive to that, and we have to figure out how to balance those things. So merely the fact that the name has been in place for decades doesn't, for me, preclude, the possibility of having it change and, be updated, in the current era. So,
sure.
Yeah.
Understood. And what that change could be, though, I guess, is the question, right? Would it be a name that reflects both parts of that monument, both parts of that landscape, that there's the Pueblo there and the Coronado artifacts there as well, or just one or the other?
Right. I think that's a very good question to take up. The individual from Santa Ana Pueblo writing the opinion pieces feels strongly that Coronado's name should be removed outright from it. But I think one of the possibilities would be to talk about it as the Pueblo site of Coahua and the Coronado Historic Site and Monument. So, I think there's some different possibilities. The other thing to be sure that the listeners and the viewers through media understand is the state, I don't think, has a current petition before it to change the place name of this particular historic site. But, it's certainly possible that would happen in the future, and it would be something that deserves a lot of consideration and thought.
Sure. Well, and this conversation, Paul Reed, seems very similar to what we're hearing maybe in other parts of the country about some of the Confederate War monuments that are in some of the southern states, of course, and some of those types of things from the Civil War. And a lot of folks are concerned about maybe some of those statues and monuments being taken down or being put away. In my thinking, I don't think anything's being destroyed or taken away, but maybe moved to like a museum for better interpretation or to kind of tell that part of the story and not have it on a prominent public display. Is that your understanding too?
Right. And in some of those cases, those statues and monuments were put up not in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War or through the Reconstruction period that lasted for a couple of decades, but were actually placed in the 50s and 60s in response to the Civil Rights Movement. So I think in that case, that's part of why many, many people see those as an issue and as a problem. And certainly that, again, the history will be told. It's in books, it's in multiple narratives, it's in museums. So this notion that we lose history by deciding to change what's in our public sphere, either in a museum display or in a plaza or a square, all these different ways to display history, the notion that we're losing it really doesn't work for me. Opinions change through time, and we have to recognize, again, in a very diverse nation, that if certain symbols are interpreted as part of a racist or colonial history, then we have to really think hard about what we're saying to people in the country and across the world, if we choose to keep those and defend them.
Right. And I would maintain, again, that their location also, maybe indirectly or maybe unintentionally, perhaps sends a stronger message as well. If I've got a statue of a Confederate war hero or what have you on the grounds of my state capitol, that just being there on the grounds of the state capitol may give it a bigger presence than if it was in a museum somewhere with a story about who this person was and what they did and why they're remembered.
That's right. In a private museum that's talking about that history is one thing. As a state government saying, this individual is still one of our heroes. That's a little more problematic, definitely. Sure.
Well, interesting. And so, Paul, as you continue with your work and look at some of these sites and things like that, Coronado being one of them, are there any others that come to mind here in the Southwest that maybe have a label or a name that is a bit misleading or maybe doesn't tell the whole story?
Well, there's some quite close to Farmington, and this is something that we've talked about in different ways, and I'm not proposing. I'll tell you that from the outset before we get the calls or whatever. That the city of Aztec doesn't need to be renamed, but Aztec Ruins National Monument is not a site that reflects the heritage of the Aztec people of Mexico. The name itself reflects a misnomer of people coming into the area in the historic period in the 1870s and 80s, and the story going around that these amazing, now as we recognize them, Chaco and Puebloan buildings, must have been built by this group to the south who built this empire, the Aztecs. So, obviously we know now that that's not what happened. So, and I'm honestly not aware, as I said, with Coronado renaming, of a formal project or petition to rename Aztec ruins national monument.
Sure.
But the name does code basically the 19th century misunderstanding about the history of the place. So it certainly isn't beyond the realm for me to think about, what that might reflect and how that could change. Place names matter. I know that there is a tendency in the media and with some groups to look at this as trying to erase some part of the history or, this notion of canceling things. But as a diverse society, we need to be able to revisit the things that matter to us, on a regular scale, to discuss those, to have a full discussion about it, to bring in different viewpoints and really kind of see, how groups feel about these different things. And when we have groups whose history has not been well represented in the modern narrative and the historic narrative, that's a reason to perhaps boost some of those narratives that haven't been told. So, and this is something that the field that I'm in anthropology and archaeology, we're doing a fairly systematic review through different groups at our national group, the Society for American Archaeology, and trying to really restructure the way we're doing the archaeology and the science to reflect much more the concerns of descendant communities, indigenous groups, if we're working with historic groups, African Americans, Hispanic Americans, to really step away from what's been a fairly limited narrative that reflects, Anglo-American values mostly. So, it's a very interesting and dynamic time, as we've talked in the past. And I don't think that this, for me, it's not a process of loss at all. It's a process of adding to what we understand about what we've known for decades, centuries, to be a very rich history, but that history hasn't been fully reflected in some of the things that we put out publicly, in what our museums might tell people, maybe what our monuments and statues tell people. So, yeah, again, I find this to be a very interesting and dynamic process. But because it represents change, there's always resistance to that. So
sure.
That's something we have to be aware of.
Well, and it represents, I think, maybe something that maybe many folks in this country never thought about would be, well, if we ask these minority groups, these groups that maybe have been underrepresented for generations, what they think, we may not like their answer.
That's right. But you know what? We can hear those answers,
yes,
and we engage in an honest dialogue and see what some of the groups whose stories haven't been told, how they feel about it, what they would like to see represented in public works and museums, and certainly in the books and the scholarly work, So that's something that I've begun to do in my own work, is to really shift away from, some of the older views and see if I can pull in other narratives. And again, the organization I work for, primarily Archaeology Southwest, we're in the process of doing this. And, again, I see a lot of positive changes coming out of this approach.
Right. Very interesting. My guest this morning is local archaeologist Paul Reed. Of course, he works with Archaeology Southwest and Salmon Ruins. We're talking a bit about some of the issues with some of the majority naming of things and sites around our country, and maybe some other groups that maybe aren't included in some of those conversations. Let's talk about something else for a moment, Paul Reed, and that is since we're causing some controversy this morning in an educated way. President Biden has put a pause on new leasing on federal lands for oil and gas leases, if I understand that correctly. And so you have been very active, I know, in some of the protections around the Chaco Canyon area here in New Mexico, of course, when it comes to federal land. So what does this mean for that ongoing conversation? And, of course, elsewhere, there's a lot of federal land in this country. Right.
Well, I think from my perspective, the way to look at this is this this is a necessary review of, a process that's been ongoing really since before the prior administration, going back, however many years we want to talk about, at least 10, 15, and on a longer scale, almost 100 years of, energy extraction being one of the dominant uses of our public lands. I do think President Biden is coming in with a different vision and looking at a much more balanced approach to energy production, one that highlights green energy, much like our governor in New Mexico. She has really pushed a clean green energy agenda with wind and solar and some other options. And, I think most of us recognize that oil and gas has a role to play, over the next couple of decades as we make this transition. But that ultimately oil and gas is not where we're going to be getting most of our energy in the future, and it's not that distant of a future at this point. So the prior administration had prioritized energy development. Energy dominance was the term that they threw out about 4 years ago, and that hasn't had the best effects on our landscapes, on people living in the midst of these oil and gas developments and other developments. And we've really, as you said, have been trying hard to protect special places like Chaco Canyon, like the area up in southeast Utah with Bears Ears, development pushing up against different places. So, a lot of us, on my side of the fence certainly welcome this pause as we take a more comprehensive look and see what our actual energy needs are. A lot of the oil and gas production that has happened over the last decade has been for export. So, it's often touted in different forms of media and the popular press that, America needs to do this oil and gas development to have security, and the fact is it's not the 1970s anymore, and oil is traded on a global market. OPEC controls some of that. There are big producers who are non-OPEC producers. The U.S. actually in 2014 became the largest net exporter of both oil and gas, oil and natural gas, I should say. Mm-hmm. So, and most of that was about profit for energy companies, and certainly, has benefited our state and other energy states. So, that economic side of it is an important part of the equation. But the other side, I think, is that boom and bust cycle that New Mexico and other energy producing states have gone through multiple times. So, I'm looking at this as the beginning of making a transition away to more stable forms of energy and energy, ways to produce energy that don't have the environmental consequences that, oil and gas and coal and others have.
Sure. Well, and I think a lot of folks would agree with you on the surface, Paul Reed, but when you do dig into it and you mention how dependent our state is, unfortunately or fortunately, on the energy industry, it's not a secret that the oil and gas industry contributes a big amount to the state budget each and every year, about more than a third, I think, if I remember correctly, maybe probably more than that, and I'll be corrected if I'm wrong. And so folks get concerned when there's news about pausing leasing or doing any of that. We were displaying an article from another media source, Inside Climate News, that kind of talks about that a lot of the producers have leases already that they haven't dealt with, and so they can continue their level of drilling for years, but this might put a pause down the road or maybe lessen that impact down the road years from now. We'll have to see, but that's kind of what your point is, I guess, is looking long term.
Right, that's exactly right, because leases for oil and gas, at least in New Mexico, companies get those, they bid on them. If a bid is successful, they can hold that lease for 10 years, and they're required to do certain things, but they don't actually have to identify a well location and drill it. They simply have to do certain things to keep the lease active. At the end of the 10 years, then they have an option to renew. So what we've seen happening over the last 4 years, and going back a few years before that, is companies stockpiling lots and lots of leases. So some of what we've heard in the media in response to, what from my perspective looks like a very reasonable review period on future leases, is a little bit of panic and some misinformation about everything grinding to a halt next week or next year. As you said, we're looking at years down the road and being able to have that time we need to continue to make this transition. So New Mexico and other oil producing states are going to continue to produce it for quite a while to come. The other side of the equation is we're talking about leases on federal land, which are a big portion of New Mexico, but it's not the majority. We have state lands, we have private lands. So we have a number of different lands in the mix here. So, anyone sort of running around saying this is the end of oil and gas, jobs, industry, and ultimately state revenues in New Mexico is really not understanding what this means in terms of impact. And again, we're kind of gets back to what we were talking about before, Scott. We're a balanced, diverse society. We need to look at things with that in mind, and that includes our energy extraction policies and figuring that out. So, I think this pause for the oil and gas activity will allow the current administration to hopefully make some good decisions and figure out, where some production in the future could continue. I'll state clearly, and we've talked about this before, we don't need energy production bumping up against the margins of Chaco Canyon and other special and sacred places that are very important to indigenous groups, Native Americans, and to our entire society. So that's not something that I will compromise on. There are other places that are perhaps more appropriate for energy development and to meet our needs. But the key there is balance, and in the area, in the Farmington field office area of BLM, the area is about 92% leased based on the most recent estimate. So not saying that we're not going to lease that remaining 8% or a portion of that 8% is not going to have a significant impact on what happens in the next few years. It's more about the future.
Right. Understood, Paul Reed. Thank you. But as you mentioned, there is a balance, and so I guess I would think that maybe there'll never be a time when there's zero oil and gas development on federal lands, but it needs to be a balanced approach, as you have said. We just have a couple of minutes remaining this morning. I wanted to ask you mentioned Bears Ears earlier, and so that area in southeast Utah had come under scrutiny under the last administration, and the borders, the boundaries, I believe, were it was made smaller by the Trump administration, and so now the thought is that maybe the Biden administration will restore those boundaries to what they were during the Obama administration. I'm trying to get all my timelines correct here, but is that where we are?
Right. So President Obama declared Bears Ears as a monument in December of 2016, towards the end of his term. It was originally set out as 1.35 million acres. So as part of a review that the Trump Secretary of Interior went through, that monument was reduced by 85% to 200,000 acres. And many folks in the preservation community felt like that had been done to open up areas for oil and gas or other developments. The interesting thing about it is there's very little oil and gas currently in some of the areas that had originally been set aside for protection. So my thought throughout this process was if that had been a good area to drill, it probably would have been developed at some point in the more remote past. The oil field north of Chaco and south of Farmington dates back to the 1920s with different bursts of activity, 30s, 50s, 70s, etc. That area in southeast Utah has never really seen large oil and gas development, which is fortunate because of the beauty that's there, the highest site density that we see anywhere in the continental U.S., and a lot of folks don't understand that. So the protection of Bears Ears really is a top priority for many of us in the preservation community and the conservation community, and we do hope that it will be restored to the original acreage that President Obama had laid out. And that's not going to impact any oil and gas activity whatsoever in that area. So as we were talking about leases and companies kind of buying up leases and stockpiling them, that was perhaps a consideration in the reduction of, under the prior administration to only 200,000 acres. But during that interval, and of course, groups went to court to stop that because there's pretty good legal argument that under the Antiquities Act, you can't rescind a monument, you can define one, but it would take congressional action to rescind it, and that did not happen in the last two Congresses. So anyway, the point is that, Bears Ears is a special place, and, in my opinion, definitely deserves to be restored to the original boundaries, and that's not going to impact any development activity that's occurred up there. So if that argument's coming out, on the other side of this, then that isn't based on what's actually happening.
Gotcha. Interesting. And I guess, Paul Reed, and you kind of mentioned it there a little bit too, if if folks want to make sure that that monument is protected and the boundaries stay where they are, where they need to be, or are restored to where they were originally, it would take an act of Congress, I guess, to keep a future president from moving the line a third time.
That's right. And the Congress, can identify boundaries for monuments. They can identify boundaries for national parks. So, and that may well be something that this Congress takes up at some point. It doesn't seem to be an immediate priority based on what we've been hearing. Right.
But of course, we have a new Secretary of the Interior, the first ever Native American that is set to be confirmed sometime this spring, Deb Haaland, and from New Mexico. And so that may bring a new perspective to some of these topics that we're talking about. I would think so.
Yeah, I think it definitely will. And I think incoming Secretary Haaland is going to do a lot of great things in the Department of Interior. And I think with her background at Laguna Pueblo and what she did as a congresswoman, I think we're going to see some very positive changes for preservation in the West. And again, striking that balance where we don't have to have just a single priority, where we can protect important places and continue with responsible development.
Right. Very interesting. Perhaps a future show with Paul Reed and Deb Haaland. We'll see what we can do. But, Paul, we're out of time this morning. I always appreciate you being with me to share all of your views and give us some perspective on some of these things that we hear being talked about in the national press. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Scott. Always a pleasure to be on.
You bet. Great to have you here. Thank you very much. That's Paul Reed from Salmon Ruins and Archaeology Southwest, my guest here on KSJE.